Economic reports are extremely important to follow and, more importantly, to understand. They can have a significant impact on the overall market, on interest rates, and also lets us know how the housing industry is doing. Now, when we take a look at these reports, they can come out at different intervals, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, sometimes quarterly, and there's different expectations that are set. There's a bar that is set to which these reports are measured against. Now, typically speaking, if we see a report come out and it's stronger than expectations, we see some outperformance, it's a good thing for the overall economy, shows the overall economy is robust, and typically stocks seem to like that, and they may oftentimes rally. Now, as we've learned previously, because of the relationship between stocks and bonds, oftentimes they are competing for the same investment dollar. That means that as we're seeing good things happen in the economy, you see money going into riskier assets like stocks, and it can oftentimes come at the expense of bonds. Now listen, there are exceptions, and the other thing to remember is that there's other things that can happen in the economy that can supersede economic reports. While they're very important, if the Fed comes out and maybe cuts rates or announces some quantitative easing, or we see some geopolitical news, that can take the direction and really take the reins. But economic reports, extremely important to understand and to follow. Now there's many different types, as we said. You could argue some of the most important for interest rates are the inflation reports. Why is inflation reports so important for interest rates? Well, inflation is the archenemy of bonds. Inflation erodes a bond's fixed return, and especially a longer-term bond such as mortgage-backed securities, let's say for 30 years. Now you're getting a fixed rate of return over those 30 years, and if inflation is on the rise, it's going to erode the buying power of that fixed rate of return. You won't be able to buy as much. So as a result, the investor has to be compensated with a higher interest rate. So that's why when you see inflation on the rise, typically interest rates, mortgage rates also have to follow and rise in suit. When we take a look at the Consumer Price Index and the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditures, those are two of the main inflation reports that we're following. These are two of the most widely viewed. They come out on a monthly basis. And while they're both very important, the Fed seems to prefer Personal Consumption Expenditures, or PCE, while in our opinion, we think the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is actually a better representation of real inflation felt by the consumer. We'll get to that in a little more detail here coming up. But first, let's discuss, if you take a look at these slides here, how these are calculated. So it's calculated on a rolling 12-month basis, and it comes out each month. So if we're in the current month, let's say of February, the report that we get that month is going to be showing us January's numbers. Now they come out each month with a monthly number, and if you add all those up, you're going to get a year-over-year number for inflation. So if you take a look at this example here, you can see January 4/10, February 2/10, and if you add all that up from January to December, you have a year-over-year inflation rate of 2%. Now this is very important to watch because when we get the number in February, which is going to be for January, it's going to replace that 4/10 of a number. So if we look at what the expectations are and what the market is anticipating that number to be, we can almost do a little bit of a forecast of what's going to happen with that year-over-year inflation rate. So in this example, when we get the number in February for January, that 4/10 January is going to fall off. Now let's say we get a number of a flat reading for the new January figure. Well, when you go ahead and do that, you're replacing 4/10 with 0. That year-over-year inflation rate is going to drop from 2% to 1.6%. Now that's a pretty big drop on a year-over-year basis, and because we know inflation is the archenemy of bonds, this is something that typically is good for interest rates, and you might see interest rates fall in reaction to this news. Now, these inflation reports have a few different components to them. They have the headline inflation number, which is really like your all-in overall inflation, but then they also have what's called a core reading. The core reading strips out the volatile food and energy prices. Now, this is what the Fed likes to look at when they're determining, hey, where is our benchmark for where we want inflation compared to where inflation is, because this is what the Fed can control. The Fed can't control necessarily what's going on with food and energy prices because, hey, maybe there's like a drought or a famine, something that is out of their control that's affecting food prices. And as far as oil goes, maybe you have some tensions with other countries that's escalating the price of oil. So they focus on this core rate that strips out food and energy prices. Now the Fed, their target can move. For a long time, their target for inflation has been at 2% on the core rate. Now remember, because inflation erodes a bond's fixed return. When you're seeing these inflation reports rise on the headline and more importantly on the core, typically that has a negative bias for mortgage-backed securities, and you can see rates go up. Now, the CPI and PPI, the Consumer Price Index and the Personal Consumption Expenditure reports, as I mentioned, are really the two most widely followed inflation reports, but there are some differences between the two. The Consumer Price Index report measures a fixed basket of goods. So it compares the prices one month, compares them the next month, and they're able to see how much prices have rose on that fixed basket of goods. Now, the reason why we think that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is a better measure of really true inflation that's felt by the consumer is because it has a large weighting towards housing, the cost to put a roof over your head, as well as out-of-pocket medical expenses, which are the medical expenses that you're really feeling. Now, the PCE, or Personal Consumption Expenditure report, it is a little bit smart in that it allows for substitutions. Let's say, for some reason, there's something going on with the production and the growth of oranges. It'll allow for substitutions, let's say, for a tangerine. So it's smart in that respect, but what really it doesn't do a good job of is factoring in the cost to put a roof over your head and those out-of-pocket medical expenses. It has a very small weighting towards those things, which you could argue are probably some of the most important to us. Instead, it focuses on things like Medicaid and Medicare, which can be skewed and artificially pushed lower by the government and things like that. But it is the Fed's favored measure of inflation. But because it doesn't have such a significant weighting towards the housing and out-of-pocket medical expenses, it's oftentimes running a lot softer or cooler than the Consumer Price Index report. But this is the one that the Fed is looking at when they're judging their monetary policy. Remember, the Fed has two mandates: maximum employment and inflation, keeping stable prices. And right now, and for a long time, they've had that number at about 2%. So they're looking at that core rating and determining their actions based on that. There's also the Producer Price Index, also known as the PPI report, and instead of measuring inflation on the consumer level, it measures it on the wholesale or producer level. Now, this report, we really consider like the Rodney Dangerfield of reports, because while it's important, it gets no respect. And the reason being is because producer costs aren't always passed down or savings to the actual consumer. Now, just like the PCE report, Personal Consumption Expenditures, and CPI, Consumer Price Index, it has a core and headline component to it, which strips out the food and energy prices that is on the core. But think about this. If a producer does incur more costs in the production of their product or service, well, that producer may then pass that cost along to the consumer, where it's going to be more expensive to the consumer, but they don't have to. They may just eat that cost themselves and have some decreased margins. How about on the flip side of things? If a producer's costs are cheaper, well, they don't have to pass that savings down. They may just take some more profit for themselves. So this is an important report to follow because it can give us some clues as to inflation as measured on the consumer level, but it doesn't always have to. And for that reason, it's not often market moving, but still is important.
All pretty straightforward. I don't need to go there.
Hey, yeah. Do you know much about the?
Oh, what?
I got it later.
Yeah. What was the question?
Okay. Yeah. Basically, do you know much about the PPI? Because to me, it seems like it would measure kind of like more like commodity prices for producers as opposed to like the cost of their goods that they're selling. Is it that's what they're saying? Like it's the cost of the goods that they're actually selling, wholesalers?
Well, they have a specific basket of goods that they're looking at, so that's defined in the PPI. Yeah, I'd have to look it up to tell you exactly what it is, but it's like same thing with CPI. It's another basket of specific types of goods, but a lot of it is commodities. And yeah, they're just going to basically tell you what these producers are paying for the inputs to production. Like that's why they're talking about it measuring wholesale inflation, because this is what the sellers are doing. Now, it doesn't always translate to consumer inflation because they may or may not pass.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. All right, cool.
Employment reports. The two we pay most attention to is CPI and PCE.
The employment reports that we receive each month are some of the most impactful for the overall market and really tells us a lot about the economy. Think about it. When you're seeing job growth that's robust, it's showing us that the economy is booming. When business is good, people are going to be hiring, and that can have a big impact on housing. The last thing you're going to want to do if you lose your job or aren't able to find a job is to go ahead and buy a home. So this report has a lot of different implications, and there's two main employment reports. You have the ADP employment report, which is typically the first Wednesday of the month or the Wednesday preceding the jobs report, which is really the big jobs report that we get. But this ADP report is released from Moody's Analytics, and it does not include government jobs, so it's just private sector jobs, and it's really considered like a preview to the big BLS or Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs report that we get that following typically Friday. Now this is based on data that's derived from 460,000 US companies and 26 million private sector workers. And as I said, it's really looked at as a preview to the jobs report, but here's the thing. Sometimes it can be a good preview and it can let you know, hey, if we see some big gains in the ADP report, we should maybe see those in Friday's big Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs report. But these numbers, they don't always track well month to month. Now, over a long period of time, they track very closely to one another. But from month to month, you can see some big differences between the two reports, so you just have to keep that in mind and be careful if you're using it as a preview for the big jobs report. Now, the BLS jobs report comes out typically the first Friday of every single month. Sometimes there are some exceptions there. But this is a detailed report, probably the most detailed one that we're going to be going through. And within this survey, there's some main components here. There's the headline jobs number, there's the unemployment rate, and then we also take a look at things like average hourly and average weekly earnings. So let's break that down. So within this jobs report, there's actually two surveys. There's the establishment survey. The real strict name for that is the Current Employment Statistics, or CES survey, but we refer to this as the establishment survey or the business survey. Now this is where you'll get the headline job creation number. So when you see the media showing how many jobs were created for a certain month, this is the headline number that they're pulling from. But this survey is really done with a lot of different modeling. It shows people that are paid during what's called the sample week. What's the sample week? That is the week during the month that encompasses the 12th of the month. So it takes a look at people that were paid during that week encompassing the 12th, but it also takes into things like birth-death ratios of businesses. And there is a lot of modeling that's done here, and this is one of the criticisms about the BLS. You can see some really huge revisions done from month to month because of all this modeling. I mean, think about it. It would be impossible to go ahead and actually try to count how many individuals are employed across the entire United States. So they use a sample, and this is extrapolated then to the rest of the working population. There's also the household survey. Now, this is something that's not really done with as much modeling, but this is actually phone calls to over 60,000 households. So with a labor force of about 127 million people, each one of these phone calls is representing about 2,000 people. This is where you get the unemployment rate from. So this can be a little bit tricky. Remember, the headline jobs number is coming from the business survey, but the unemployment rate is actually coming from a completely different survey within this report, where it's not done with as much modeling, but it's done with phone calls to individuals. So again, a high margin for error here, but there's also a job creation component within that household survey. So when you take a look at how many jobs are created and you take a look at the labor force, you're able to then derive the unemployment rate. But there's more than one unemployment rate as well. There's what's called the U3 unemployment rate, and then there's what's called the U6. So when you're taking a look at the media and what's depicted to you out there, everybody's looking at the U3 unemployment number. But there are some issues with that. There's some things like discouraged workers or people that are marginally attached to the workforce. So what does that mean? Well, that means that these numbers can be artificially lower than what the real unemployment rate is because, hey, if you weren't looking for a job over the last 4 weeks, we're not going to count you as in the labor force and we're not going to count you as unemployed. So these are some things to keep in mind when you're looking at these numbers. Now, the U6 unemployment rate, that's really your real all-in unemployment rate. That includes everything, including people that are working part-time for economic reasons. Now, also within this report, there's something called average hourly and average weekly earnings. So this is showing you how much people are earning per hour and how much people are earning per week. We like to focus on the weekly earnings because somebody could be earning more per hour, but if they get their hours cut, they're really not earning as much potentially. So we look at the average weekly earnings, which really shows you what somebody is taking home, and this can be a very good indicator of what's called wage-pressured inflation. Remember, inflation, the arch enemy of bonds. So if we start to see these numbers increasing, it can be a negative impact on mortgage-backed securities as well as interest rates. But the jobs report, probably one of the most impactful out there. You can see some really big market swings depending on those really three main aspects: the job creation number, the unemployment rate, and then also if there's any wage-pressured inflation in the average hourly and average weekly earnings. Now, I already mentioned a few of the criticisms of the jobs report. One being the massive revisions that happen. You can see revisions in the hundreds of thousands, even in the millions, depending on what time period you're looking at. So there's a big margin for error here. But in addition to that, there's some really tricky stuff that goes on with the labor force. And we mentioned some of these things before with people that are considered marginally attached to the labor force, people that have not looked for jobs in the last 4 weeks. Listen, these people are still unemployed. They don't have a job. But because they haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, they're just removed from the equation. They're removed from the labor force. They're removed from people that are unemployed. And this can skew this lower, which isn't really the real look, which is why the U6 is probably really the best representation of what the true unemployment rate is. Now, bringing this back full circle, the jobs report is very, very important for many reasons. Like we said in the beginning here, it's going to show you how the economy is performing. If you have robust economic growth, the first thing businesses do, they hire people. And that will then likely impact the stock market higher. Stocks may like that news, and that could come at the expense of bonds. But also, just think about the housing market. People are not going to be buying homes if they don't have a job, if they don't feel secure in their job. So this can have some really big implications for the housing market as a whole as well. So really important one to follow and to understand. Initial jobless claims is more of a real-time reading on people that are losing their jobs. Initial claims focuses on people that have filed for unemployment benefits for the first time in the previous week. So this is a report that we get every single Thursday, and it measures that previous week, and it shows people that have filed for unemployment benefits for the first time, but it also has a component of it called continuing claims. So these are people that are continuing to receive benefits. They already had their initial claim at some previous point in time, and they're continuing to collect benefits. The continuing claims component is on a 2-week delay. So initial claims measures how many people over the previous week filed for unemployment benefits for the first time, while continuing claims, those people continuing to receive benefits, is looking back 2 weeks. Now, when you look at this, depending on what's going on in the economy, if you're looking during the COVID period, there's also some other tricky stuff that's thrown in here that's not in the headlines. Things like pandemic unemployment assistance, which are in addition to these initial claims, but you won't see in the headlines. You have to look a little bit under the hood, per se, to see these numbers. So what you want to look at is you want to look at the total people that are receiving some type of unemployment benefit. And when we get these numbers, we like to dive deep into these and to try to come up with almost like a real-time unemployment rate. Remember, that jobs report that comes out, it has some things that skews it a little bit lower, and it's looking for the previous month. This is more real-time, so if we take a look at how many people are continuing to receive benefits, how many people have come back to work when we compare these weeks side by side to each other, and we look at the overall labor force, we can come up with a pretty accurate real-time reading on what the unemployment rate really is.
That's all pretty straightforward, right, guys?
Sí, señor.
Mr. Senior, to you.
No.
The housing reports are relevant to us for obvious reasons. They're going to let us know the health of the new and existing home markets. Now, starting with existing home sales, this you could argue is the most important one because the existing market is much larger than the new home market. It makes up about 85% of the homes out there. Now, this is reported on a monthly basis from the National Association of Realtors, also known as the NAR, and this measures closings on existing homes. So let's think about that for a second. This is not signed contracts. This is a closing on an existing home. So that represents buyers likely shopping in the preceding 2 months. So in those preceding 2 months, they're out there shopping for homes, signing contracts, and then likely closing about a month or two later. This is on single-family existing homes. And this is really also one of those reports that has a few components. You have that headline number that's going to show you how many closings there were on existing homes. But then you also have what's called the median home price. This is a big misconception. So what is the median home price? It means that that's really like the middle number. Half the homes sold above that number and half the homes sold below that number. But the media would lead you to believe that this is an appreciation figure. Now listen, can it mean that home prices are rising or falling? Yes. But there's other reports out there that do a much better job of measuring what true appreciation is. Think about it like this. If you have more lower-priced homes selling or more higher-priced homes selling in a given month, that can skew that number. And when you're looking on a year-over-year basis, it could say, okay, median home price is up 5% or 6%. Doesn't necessarily mean that homes.
So I'm stopping it right here for a second just because this is something that every one of our clients is going to be seeing in the news. So people like Diana Oleg, who's Barry and Dan and myself hate just because it's all doom and gloom. She's been telling people not to buy houses for about 10 years now, saying the housing market is a bad market to buy in. So it's good to know how these work because right now, I think everybody's noticing the same thing where if you've got any listings, if you're working any open house or your realtors have any listings in the $1.5 to $2.5 million range, the amount of buyers out there at that price point is significantly diminished. So it's a lot slower. Generally, you're not going to get hardly any traffic at those. So if we're going off the median home sales, you're going to have, we still have a pretty robust market under, I would say 700, 800,000. It's still pretty competitive. Still a lot of people out there shopping at that price point. But this is something that's going to start to skew the numbers in the coming months. So if you start asking, or you have clients start telling you, oh, I saw that, the median home price is coming down, or I saw that housing values are coming down. It's important to know this so that you can explain it to clients because it's not what it seems, but the media will skew it to get clicks.
Rose by that amount, it just means that maybe there was a greater amount of lower or higher price homes sold. So make sure to get that one right. The other thing here is this, is that there's a supply component within this existing home sales report as well. And obviously supply is very important. You have first law of economics, demand and supply. And if you have strong demand and tight supply, well, that's a recipe for what? Higher prices. Well, a lot of times you might not see a robust number with the headline sales figure. Now that could look like a negative for the housing market, but you have to remember something. There's a difference between housing the investment as well as housing the economic driver. And when we take a look at the economic driver, listen, housing makes up for approximately, let's say, 15 to 20% of GDP, gross domestic product. By the way, that's a report that we're going to get to in just a little bit here. But the more important thing that we really care about is not so much the transactions that are occurring and how that's contributing to the economy. We really care about more so the customer side of things. We care about housing the investment. Hey, if I invest in this home, right, likely one of the largest purchases of my life, am I going to make money on this? Am I going to be underwater on this? So sometimes it could be a little bit of a double-edged sword out there, right? Maybe you don't want to see such high numbers of sales out there. It's okay if demand is strong, but you have really, really tight supply. If you have a situation where there would be more sales if there was more supply out there, the demand is still very strong, and it's a good sign for housing. So make sure to remember that there's a difference between housing the investment, which is what your customer really cares about, and housing the economic driver that's going to look at the amount of those transactions that are occurring. There's also something called pending home sales. Now, pending home sales is really like a forward-looking indicator for existing home sales. Pending home sales is also reported by the National Association of Realtors, but this is measuring signed contracts during that month. So it comes out each month. Let's say it's for the month of February. It's going to show you how many people were actually out there shopping and signing contracts on existing homes. And again, this is an important one because existing homes measures about 85% of the total housing stock out there. And as I mentioned, a great leading indicator. When we take a look at new home sales, this is measuring about 15% of the market, the new home market. And this is also contracts. This is not closings during that month. This is showing people out there signing on the dotted line for new homes. This is not reported by the NAR, it's reported by the Census Bureau, but also a very important report to look at, and it has some of those other components. Just like existing home sales has the median home price as well as the supply out there, this report has that as well. Also important to keep in mind and remember that that median home price is not necessarily representative of appreciation. It's just showing you that middle-priced home that sold, half the home sold above it, half the home sold beneath it. Housing starts is a really good indicator of future supply out there. Housing starts is showing you new construction. And within this report, there's actually housing starts as well as housing permits. This is reported by the Census Bureau. And a housing start, the definition of it, is really the excavation for a foundation of a new residential structure. So essentially you're like breaking ground on a new home, whereas permits is authorization to build. So permits is going to be more of your future indicator of housing starts. But overall, this is really going to show us the future supply that's going to be out there of new homes. Now, this is another one that the media sometimes gets wrong and messes up. While the overall number is very, very important, there's really two components within both the starts and the permits. There's single family as well as multifamily. Now, multifamily, it's important, but single family is really the lifeblood of the housing market. The single family homes is what we care about. If we see a really strong figure here, but it's all in multifamily, that's not really necessarily going to mean that we're going to see a lot of supply in what we care about, which is those single family homes. So when you're looking at these reports, it's important to break down the distinction between the two and focus on what is the strength in both single family starts and single family permits. Also looking at the new construction market is the NAHB, or National Association of Home Builders, Housing Market Index. Now, all these reports that we've been going over come out on a monthly basis, but they track the previous month. Well, the NAHB, it does also come out on a monthly basis, but it's more of a real-time indicator. For instance, if this report came out in the month of August, it would be measuring that current month of August. So it's measuring the month in which it comes out in, and it measures builder confidence. So how confident are builders feeling, almost pulse on the figure of the market because it's very real time. Also, this report, it's an index between 1 and 100. So a level of 50 is really like your baseline. If you have a reading that comes in above 50, it signals expansion. If you have a reading that comes in below 50, it signals contraction. And there's three components within this that are all measured in the same way. So you have current sales expectations, so how confident are builders at the current environment of sales. They also have a future-looking one that's out like 6 months that shows future sales expectations. And then one of the most important ones in there is buyer traffic. So how much traffic are we seeing out there shopping for homes? So remember, a reading above 50, positive sign shows expansion. Below 50, negative sign shows contraction. Now, we mentioned that the media does several things to get these reports wrong, but one of the things that the media does a bad job of is really taking a look at the math and looking at what's called the revisions. Just like we mentioned the jobs report, one of the criticisms of that was how you can see significant revisions from month to month. There's also revisions in these housing reports, albeit not as large, but there is revisions from month to month that you have to take into account. So what I want to do here is just take a look at this example. So when you take a look, let's pretend that we got the new home sales report for May. And when you see these reports, it shows you an annualized pace, right? So you didn't get 720,000 new homes sold in the month of May, but up to that point and based on the sales we saw in May, it brings you to an annualized pace of 720,000. Now, the media will compare this to the April figure, which, let's say in this example, was 730,000. So when you compare 720,000 to 730,000, well, that's a negative 1.3% change that we saw there. But here's the thing, and the media won't bring this up. The April figure was originally reported at 700,000. So they're taking that account, they're not taking that revision into account. They're looking at the revised figure and comparing it to that new May number, so they get negative 1.3%. But in aggregate, we've seen a gain. The real way to do this, to really see the strength of the report, would be to look at the original April report at 700,000, and then look at the new May report that came out at 720,000, and you'll actually see an aggregate gain there, taking the revision into account of a positive 2.9%. So listen, media is not very good at math. Make sure you take a look at some of these revisions and take this into account, because it can change the entire scope of the report. And remember, listen, the media, it's an eyeball business. The media wants to get fear instilled in you. You never turn on the news and say, yeah, everything's really great, right? It's, all doom and gloom. So it's no exception here. The media is looking for shock value. Make sure you do the math and you take a look at the revisions. Now, we mentioned some bad ways to measure appreciation, such as the median home price, but there are several really good appreciation reports that we get on a monthly basis. Really, the gold standard of reports is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. So what this report does is it tracks monthly changes in the value of residential real estate. And it is a little bit dated, meaning unlike looking back maybe 1 month, this report looks back 2 months ago. So a little bit of stale data, but highly accurate, considered the best appreciation report out there. And it's based on resales of single-family homes. Condominiums and co-ops are excluded from this, and there's 2 components within this report. There's the national index as well as the 20-city index. There's actually a 10-city one too, but the really important ones that we focus on are the national index as well as the 20-city index. And what they do is they come out with a monthly appreciation figure, so how much month over month have homes appreciated, and then they also give you an annual figure. Now, why is this so important? Because it's really about being an advisor, right? If we're not showing value, if we're just talking about rate or maybe getting qualified, listen, those things are important. But being a certified mortgage advisor is about, in part, being able to articulate what's the financial opportunity in purchasing a home, right? And these reports will really help you to be able to articulate that and quantify that for your customer. For example, customers buying a $300,000 home. Let's say there's an appreciation rate in that market of 5%. That means that over the next year, if we saw that same appreciation rate, they could expect to see a gain of about $15,000, opening that customer's eyes probably for the first time, showing them the financial opportunity that exists. Hey, maybe they're in a situation where they got to come in over asking price. Maybe it's a hot housing market out there, and to win that contract, they got to come in over ask. Nobody likes to do that, right? Nobody likes to come in full price. This can help open their eyes and help them evaluate if that's the right decision. Now, remember, this report's backward looking. In a little bit, we're going to take a look at some other appreciation reports that also have a forecasting component to it going forward. There's also the FHFA House Price Index, and just like the Case-Shiller, this report is on a 2-month lag, but this one isn't tracking the same homes. This one's only tracking homes reported by the FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Agency. So Fannie and Freddie loans only, not going to include some of those loans like FHA or VA loans, mortgages that are insured by federal entities. However, it also only tracks loans with conforming loan amounts, right, and Fannie and Freddie loans. So while you can have a $1 million conforming loan, for the most part, you could say that these are going to track lower priced homes, not necessarily the full scope of homes such as the Case-Shiller report. Because of that, and because we know that, hey, as you get closer to the median home price in specific markets, you're going to see greater levels of appreciation. You know, most homes are, you know, the hot kind of area of homes is typically speaking between like 200,000 and 400,000. That's where you're seeing really a lot of the traffic and a lot of demand. Because of that, they're going to see higher appreciation rates for those lower priced homes. So because this is measuring homes with conforming loan amounts, you're likely going to see some higher appreciation figures, and we've seen that historically, than the Case-Shiller report. The CoreLogic Home Price Index report is a little bit unique compared to the FHFA and the Case-Shiller home price reports because it's not on a 2-month lag like those are. It measures the previous month, and it does still give you a month-over-month appreciation reading as well as a year-over-year appreciation reading. But instead of just giving you the historical look back, it also gives you a forecasting component. So it'll give you a forecast for what's the appreciation expected across the US for next year, as well as for next month. And this can really be beneficial in trying to articulate that opportunity to the customer and showing them what that potential investment in their home could look like.
All right, guys, any questions there? Nope.
Yeah. So all these reports are, not very fun to look at most of the time. So does MBS Highway aggregate this information? And are these what I'm looking at? Like these like little graphics that's from MBS Highway?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the beautiful things about NBS Highway is they take all of the kind of the minutia of these reports and they weed out just the like important stuff. So they'll distill it into one page of data. And whenever these reports come out, they'll put together all of these graphics that you can use. So if anybody has, if you haven't access to MBS Highway, or if you guys want to, jump in with Dustin or Cynthia, use their MBS Highway, because I have one specifically for them. You cannot log into mine because it kicks me out. But you can log into that, use theirs with them. You can actually download that and send it to your realtors too. And actually you can download it in like PDF format, like that, PNG format. There's a bunch of different formats you can do. You can embed it into your emails to your agents. But yeah, it's a lot easier to do that than to sift through all the,
Yeah, it's not fun. If you ever look at the government reports, they suck, as you can imagine. Yeah.
Especially like the federal, like when the Federal Open Market Committee meets and you look through that, it's like literally the same thing every single time. It looks like somebody's putting together like the summary of a bill that they're putting together.
Yeah, pretty bad. Yeah. Okay. So cool. MBS Highway for the win. Cool.
Yeah.
I like it.
Right.
We'll get on there. Yeah.
This one wasn't as sexy as everything else, but these are really important. So these reports are very important. So anyway, till next week, guys. That was it.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome.